Hum inside my heart a little while. Come closer with the honey of your song. Your dance is a code, is a pathway to what's given. I am learning how to listen.
Okay, welcome friends to our episode on the Lost Sutras. I am so excited for today's episode. We have a very special guest, Daniel Clement. Daniel was one of my very first teachers back in my first yoga teacher training, and it's such an honor to have him on the show today. So, about Daniel, like many yoga practitioners and teachers, he has a natural predisposition to the yoga practice. The qualities of self study, a desire for balance and harmony, and a somewhat sensitive and introverted personality served him as a musician and a songwriter. He found the same qualities could be directed toward understanding and practicing yoga. He became interested in the Hatha Yoga practice in the mid 1990s as a way to heal his back injury. After attending classes in Iyengar Yoga, he gravitated towards Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga and was lucky enough to find Fiona Stang as one of his many teachers. He practiced this rather intense form of yoga regularly for 3 years before attending his first yoga teacher training with David Swenson. David honored the yoga his teacher had taught him, but was not afraid to add his own voice. After that training, Daniel was asked to assist in the morning self-led classes at City Yoga in Vancouver. That experience taught him the value of observation, both to the poses the students were working in and the relationship each student had to the practice as a whole. Daniel is a very acknowledged and accomplished practitioner and teacher of yoga, and I am so thrilled to have him on this podcast sharing his wisdom with you. So, let's begin. So, before we begin, may we all take some time to ground into this space and into ourselves. Let's begin by taking a deep inhale through the nose and exhale out the mouth. Thank you all so much. Let's begin. Okay, so good morning, Daniel. Thank you so much
Hi.
for joining me here.
It's great to be here, Daniel.
It's such an honor to have you on the podcast as you were one of my very first yoga teachers. And so this feels like a big circling back having you here in this space.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what year that was when I was up in Nelson doing that training. I believe it was Nelson. Was that 2012, 13, something like that, or later?
No, it would have been 2012 or 2013. I think it was, yeah, 10 or 11 years ago now. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's a big chunk of time for sure. Yeah.
definitely.
How has it been going? Have you and you've been teaching, of course, since then. So, how have you found that since that training and beyond in terms of
Well,
teaching?
I think you're a great teacher, and you highly inspired me from that training. And many people who have reached out to me about teacher trainings, I've actually pointed in your direction. So I've had quite a few friends who have come and studied with you now, which I'm really happy about making those connections. But yeah, teaching's been great, and the path has been unfolding. But I'd love to hear more about you and your story and what brought you to yoga and what brought you to teaching.
For sure. Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. So I started, it's been a long time now. It was the mid 1990s, and I'd suffered with I had a back injury as a teenager. I'm not sure how I did that, but I had a chronic low back issue and a lot of pain. So I went to chiropractors and all kinds of stuff to try to get it sorted out. And I remember, receiving some short-term relief, and then I also remember trying to like put my body in shapes that would relieve the back pain. Like I had no idea about yoga or postural yoga at this point at all, but just like, was there a way to sort of stretch or move things around to try to release the pain? So I was, kind of experimenting. I don't know why I didn't think about yoga at that time, but I was sort of experimenting with pain relief through postural contortionism, I guess you could call it. And then after that, I think I read an article that was talking about Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, this very dynamic practice of flowing in and out of postures, and that both Sting and Madonna were doing this. So that was enough for me to get started. So I went to a class in Vancouver, taught by, I believe it was Mike Dennison was my first teacher. And I probably told you guys this story many years ago because I usually tell it at most of the trainings, and I had no idea what to expect. So I showed up in corduroy pants and like a button-down shirt. And Mike said, do you have anything else to wear? Like, because it's going to be hot and you're going to sweat a lot. And I didn't really take him seriously, I guess. So I thought, well, no, I don't have anything, but I'd still really like to attend. So I went in and they were doing these extremely dynamic postures, and it was so engaging and interesting just to be in that environment where you're practicing on your own, but you're with people, but no one's talking, they're just breathing. So it's a fundamentally different thing than, I think, for people with social anxiety, it's actually a great thing. So you get to go and be with people, but you don't have to say anything. There's no expectation that you have to have a conversation. So I really enjoyed the practice, and lay down for Shavasana. Had a very quite profound experience of relaxation in Shavasana. And of course, my beige corduroy pants were like a few shades of darker from the sweat after the class. But I enjoyed it so much, of course, I kept coming back and signed up for regular classes. And I did that for about 3 years regularly. And then I started branching out. I'll tell you maybe a little bit more about the teaching part of it, but I started from there to seek other forms of yoga that were going to help my back even more than Ashtanga yoga did.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Ashtanga is really emphasized in this world or ideal of being very activating, right? And so I definitely could picture you showing up in courts and a button-up shirt to your first class and seeing the sweat pooling afterwards. That painted a beautiful image in my head. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. But that's really amazing that as you were experiencing chronic pain, that Ashtanga was the first form or style of yoga that you were drawn to or that you went and practiced, because usually we think of that as a very like athletic or highly advanced form of yoga, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure why I chose that myself. That's actually that you're the first person who's actually asked that question, is why did I gravitate towards that? You would have thought it would have been something more therapeutic. And the truth is, I mean, Ashtanga yoga practice did help me get stronger and a little more flexible for sure, but it didn't actually address the root, the driver of the back pain. In fact, as you probably know, in Ashtanga yoga, the first sequence, what they call the primary sequence, or the primary one that you start with, is mostly forward folding. So there's a lot of flexion, spinal flexion, which a lot of people are doing most of their day anyway. There's not a lot of back bending in that sequence. So it wasn't particularly therapeutic for what I needed for my back. I needed to recreate a lumbar curve in my spine, which I now know years later was the issue. So it was only after experimenting with Iyengar yoga and then Anusara yoga and a few different styles of, you could say, more alignment-based forms of yoga, meaning, ways of looking at the practice to help realign misalignments or chronic issues with the body than just a strong physical practice, designed to do a bunch of poses. So when I started to do that, when I started investigating alignment-based yoga and understanding how the body worked, then I started to understand what my back actually needed in order to heal it. And this is after I had already been teaching for a few years. So this wasn't right away. I actually was teaching Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga in Vancouver, and also in a small community called White Rock, just by the border, the US border, in a little studio to mostly 40 and 50-year-old ladies that were coming. They wanted to do yoga. So I was trying to teach them how to, if you've ever seen Ashtanga yoga, how to jump through your arms and sit down and do all this really nutty acrobatic stuff. And they accosted me at the end of one class and said, listen, we really like you, but we don't want to do any of that stuff. Can you please just teach us something that we can actually do? So that kind of happened around the same time as I was exploring how to heal my own back. And so that was sort of a driver for me to change my teaching style as well. And after that, and that's its own story, but after I started getting interested in that, then I had an opportunity to go to Shanghai. I was offered to teach teacher training in Shanghai, and I'd never done a teacher training before, so I went over there, and I thought I was equipped to begin to teacher training at that point. Now it was more focused on therapeutic alignment rather than just a very strong practice.
Amazing. So your first teacher training you taught, was it with alignment-based yoga as the root of it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I tried to, whenever you learn something new, I think there's a process where you're still holding on to the way you did something before, and then trying to incorporate what you're learning as new things into that. And sometimes that's successful. Sometimes you can blend styles, and sometimes it's just not particularly successful. So what I found eventually with Ashtanga yoga was there are a few components like the breath and the discipline. Uh, and you could say maybe the duration of the postural holds that can be carried over to an alignment based form of yoga, but there's a lot of it that doesn't make a lot of sense in Ashtanga yoga. Particularly, there's a kind of a guru, a deference to the guru. In other words, Patabi Joyce or whoever happens to be your teacher in Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, there's an expectation that the posture should look a certain way, um, and I'm speaking as it's originated from Patabi and brought over. I know new teachers are not doing this so much anymore, but there's a like triangle pose has a certain shape. There's no emphasis on using blocks. There wasn't really a therapeutic angle. Like in other words, if something's hurting, how do I deal with that? How do I counteract that pain? So a lot of those things couldn't really be carried over into what I was teaching, what I was learning myself, and what I began to teach in my trainings. So my trainings beginning in 2006 were pretty much based on alignment-based yoga with just a little bit, maybe a small component of Ashtanga yoga as a historical component of the training.
Amazing. So yeah, for those who don't know much about Ashtanga yoga, could you take a couple moments here to describe what the practice is like? You emphasize that there's no use of props and it's not really considered a therapeutic form of yoga. So how would you describe what the Ashtanga Vinyasa practice looks like as offered by Patabi Joyce?
Yeah, well, this is great. So we can go back a little bit before Patabi and talk about T. Krishnamacharya, Tirumurli Krishnamacharya, who's understood to really be kind of the grandfather of modern postural yoga. He died in 1985. He lived to be 100 years old, and his two main students are BKS Iyengar and Patabi Joyce. So probably most people know Iyengar as the kind of founder of most of the yoga, so much of the yoga that you see, especially therapeutic restorative forms of yoga. Iyengar is responsible for that. His teacher is Krishnamacharya. And of course, Krishnamacharya also taught Patabi Joyce, and Patabi Joyce really preserved what Krishnamacharya had taught him. Now, there's a whole side to this that maybe we don't have time to go into, but it looks to be pretty probable that Krishnamacharya's redevelopment of postural yoga in the 1930s and 1940s in India referenced postures that were available within the yogic corpus in India, but he was also drawing very probably from Western gymnastics and all kinds of other Danish fundamental gymnastics in order to reformat a very dynamic style of yoga that doesn't seem to have existed before within the Indian tradition. So he was a real kind of rebranding yoga and reimagining yoga. And so that style of practice, that very dynamic style based on strong breath and a postural sequence, actually having set sequences of postures, doesn't seem to show up anywhere in the ancient yoga, in the ancient text on postural yoga, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. They talk about poses, but they don't talk about how to put them together and how to create sequences out of this. So this is a kind of a new thing probably very influenced by things like photography as well, right? You could actually take pictures now of photographs of poses and see how they work together. So Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois both were instrumental in developing this new form of postural yoga. And his students primarily were the Mysore Palace kids, like the kids from mostly boys from maybe 8 to about 15 or 16 years old. So his audience for what he was teaching was very young, lanky, dynamic, energetic kids. So it seems to make sense that this very dynamic form of yoga would map onto their bodies and their capacities. And then he started to teach Westerners, and the Westerners that he taught started to bring the practices of Ashtanga yoga over to North America. And then there's a whole story about how that spreads and becomes what we call flow yoga or vinyasa yoga. But it really, all of those things can be traced back to Krishnamacharya's influence on postural yoga. But just to say that the very dynamic transitions in Ashtanga yoga are very particular and really a creation or a recreation, and have a lot to do with Pattabhi Jois's influence as well as Krishnamacharya.
Amazing. And yeah, as you had said, BKS Iyengar was kind of the one who offered more of like a therapeutic approach. And some people credit him as to creating a lot of the props that we use these days. Do you want to speak to the history of BKS Iyengar and maybe why that transition was inspired with him?
Yeah, it's a really that's a really rich vein. So he BKS Iyengar only studied. They both only studied with Krishnamacharya for a relatively short period of time. I think Iyengar may have studied with Krishnamacharya for roughly a year or so. And Krishnamacharya was known to be a very difficult teacher to work with. You can imagine just the culture at the time, over 100 years ago. And even beyond that, I think Krishnamacharya's personality itself was by all accounts pretty hard to be around. So I think Iyengar was happy, and he actually mentions, I think, in one of his biographies, that he was quite happy to leave his teacher, and he had an opportunity to go to teach in Pune, in India. And so he knew a little bit about yoga. Of course, think about just having been taught for roughly a year of anything, no matter how good your teacher is, you're still a relative neophyte when it comes to teaching. So Iyengar is invited to teach a group of older women in Pune. So he pretty much abandons the Ashtanga Vinyasa style of yoga, as far as we can tell, just about immediately, and begins to, of course, adapt yoga to the people that he's teaching. It's kind of what I was talking about when I went to White Rock. It was a very similar kind of an idea. You just have to change what you're teaching based on the people that you're teaching. So Iyengar is teaching at first an older group of people, and then he starts to notice, again, their capacities and begins to change his teaching based on that. And as far as his development of props, we know for sure, I mean, the yoga mat was only developed in 1990. I think it was, I can't remember the company, but they used to use flooring underlay as yoga mats. Even when I started, we would roll out big rolls of flooring underlay and cut them into 6-foot pieces. So it was only in 1990 that individual yoga mats became available. So when you look at old pictures of him teaching in the 70s, there's no yoga mats. He's just on a hardwood floor normally, or maybe he's using a blanket when it comes to sitting down and actually doing the floor work. So I don't know whether he was responsible for mats, but we know that he was responsible for using yoga bricks, that he used to call them, or wooden blocks as hand supports and supports for the body. He developed bolsters and all kinds of really complex wooden supports in order to support the body. I think a lot of Iyengar's aim seems to be putting the body into a position in which there's an amount of stimulus that will allow it to be able to change, essentially, and able to adapt to that stimulus. So rather than flowing quickly pose to pose, a lot of Iyengar's work is about putting the body in a static position where the person is still muscularly engaged, but there's a stretching or a dynamic component of elongation happening in order to do things like decompress the spine. And he got into a lot of therapeutics as time went by, but you could say that the bright line between the two would be flowing with the breath, which would be a very much something that Pattabhi would have taught, versus looking at the anatomy of the body and adapting shapes in order to heal them. And that would have been more by Iyengar's aim.
Thank you for that defining line between the two. It's really easy to um, feel how these two students were able to step into that role of teacher and cater the practice to exactly what they needed, and then therefore their students. And when we look at a lot of ancient teachers, that's kind of the understanding of a good teacher, right? Is the ability to change the practice to meet their students in their personal constitution and where they're at in that moment. So I consider you a great teacher. And as you were accessing or first initially going on the path of yoga, and you said that you came to yoga from chronic back pain, and a lot of people in our modern world are on that same path. They come to yoga for chronic low back pain in particular. So after Ashtanga and you found Anusara and Iyengar yoga, how were you able to formulate a practice to meet your body where it was at and actually see benefits coming from your daily practice?
Yeah, that's great. So I think when the body starts to readapt, like let's say we'll keep it particular here, low back pain for many people, this is not always the case, but it's probably predictable. Our spine has natural curves in it, and the one that seems to be disrupted the most for people that experience pain is the lumbar spine or the low back. And if you look at a healthy, I mean healthy meaning pain-free and mobile and functional spine, you generally won't see a reverse curve, meaning an outward curve in the low back. You'll see some degree, it's different for everybody. Some people have very, very deep lumbar curves, and that can be very healthy, just the way that their spine is built. But everybody will probably have some degree of a natural inward curve in their spine in order for it to be, because the nerves that run through there, the spinal cord, if it's pushed the other direction, if it's rather than internally curved, if it's externally curved, there can be compression created that creates nerve pain in that area, because it's not evolved to be in that shape. And this a longer discussion about being bipedal and being upright versus being on all fours, and we may still be adapting to that upright position, and that might be one of the reasons we're still having difficulties or are having difficulties with the low back, because we may need a few more millennia of evolution to really get to the place where it's pain-free. But for me, once after kind of moving away a little bit from Ashtanga and then looking at, okay, what's causing me back pain, and starting to understand some of the cues that show up in a more alignment-based form of yoga, like, extend your low back, and adapting postural shapes, like rather than doing the hardest form of a pose, or the pose, a way to do the pose that doesn't allow you to stretch the low back, then using props or changing the shape of the pose such that you can actually extend and naturally recurve your lower back. So once I started to understand the benefit of doing that, now the poses weren't something that I was trying to get my body into. They were an opportunity um, to access parts of the body that needed to be strengthened or elongated. That's generally what happens in yoga. So my framing for what practice was changed after that. So rather than getting on my mat in the morning and say, okay, I've got to do 5 sun salutation A and 5 sun salutation B, because that's just the way it's done, regardless of whether my back gets tweaked every time I come into upward facing dog. Then I said, okay, before I do that, and this is actually how I started, I didn't put that aside completely. I said, I'm going to do my de rigueur 10 sun salutations, but before I get there, I'm going to stretch my low back, and then you can see where this goes, right? And after a while, your whole practice is, again, of course, healing the thing that's injured, because that's the first thing you should start with. And then it just turns back into, once that became functional again for me, and the pain went away, it took a few months to happen, then I could reapproach postures like I mentioned, like the sun salutation, or a sequence like the sun salutation, and then recognize that when I'm coming up into upward facing dog from a prone position on the ground, and I'm experiencing a twinge in my low back, rather than saying, okay, well, I just have to suffer through this, I guess this is what's required, to say, and now you get to apply critical thinking. So you can say, my low back is in pain when I come into spinal extension. in a pose like upward facing dog. Why? When does it happen? Where are my arms and legs when this is happening? What happens when I strengthen my legs? What happens when I try to elongate my low back first before putting it into extension? Maybe I need to do a form of the pose that's less deep. Maybe I need to use props for my hands so I can get a mechanical advantage. So once you start looking at the poses that way and using pain as an indicator that something is going awry, then you can come back and kind of rebuild the practice from a more, quote, therapeutic or rehabilitative viewpoint. And so that's what I started doing. And that's how I started teaching too. I started basically slowing everything down and not assuming that the poses were innately or organically therapeutic, but that they could be if they were done in a way that helped the student that was trying to do them. And then the process from there is how do you educate somebody else as to how to do the poses in a way that's going to be good for them, which is not an easy thing to do, but it's definitely possible.
Wow, thank you for that. I think something that I've really noticed as a stepping into the role of teacher and having students come to class is there's a difficulty differentiating between pain and discomfort. So would you be willing to paint a better picture for us so that we can really notice in our practice when maybe a little bit of an adjustment or mechanical support could help instead of hinder us?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's another really a great thing to consider. So pain pain can occur with tissue damage and pain can occur without tissue damage. So if you this is information is from Neil Pearson. I have to give him props for this. I took a training with him many years ago. He's a pain specialist. And so if you take a drink of a Slurpee, like an iced drink on a cold day, and you do it too fast and the straw is too big, a lot of that ice will hit the roof of your mouth and it'll lower the temperature of the roof of your mouth quite dramatically. And what happens is it feels like your brain is freezing. Like it's really, really. If you've ever had it happen, it's extremely painful for a few seconds and then you take another drink and it happens again. But that feeling, that pain you're experiencing, is not an indicator of tissue damage. There's nothing is injured when that's happened. It's just the change in temperature and the sensitivity of the roof of your mouth to that temperature change. So that's an example of pain occurring where there's no tissue damage. And the opposite can occur. So you can be snowboarding, you could be skiing, doing something really dynamic where you're focusing all of your attention on something like not falling down or staying on a ski path. And then you might tweak your knee. Maybe the ski goes in the wrong direction or something happens and you actually can rip cartilage in your knee and you won't even be aware of the injury until you get to the bottom of the hill or later on that day, because your mind's energy is focused on another task and the pain signals are kind of disguised at that point. They're just you're not aware of them. So you can have pain without tissue damage. You can have tissue damage without pain. The hard part when we start to talk about postural yoga and making a differentiation between what is discomfort and what is pain, we have yet another level to talk about here, which is how stoic or how sensitive somebody is to stimulus. So you could have somebody, and I have students like this that let's go back again to something like upward facing dogs. It's a great one because of the shape of the pose. And those of you who are listening, if you can imagine this, as you have your hands on the ground and you push up into a back bend that's supported only by your feet and your palms, there's a lot of potential compression in your low back when you do that. Just the nature, the geometry of the pose lends itself to compressing the low back. It's actually quite challenging to elongate the low back and go into spinal extension like that at the same time. So I've had students that when I look at them, it looks to me like their back is compressed. Like if I were them, I would be experiencing pain in my low back. But when I ask them, I say, how does that feel? Like it feels fine. So there are students that might be experiencing low back compression in that pose with no pain. And I've had other students who have maybe been sensitized to low back pain. We're talking a lot about low back pain. It could be a number of things, but for clarity's sake, let's stick with low back pain. They might come into a very gentle version of cobra or upward facing dog and still be experiencing pain. But when I look at them, when I look at the geometry of the pose, what they're doing and how sort of expansive their low back looks rather than compressed, it looks to me like if it were me, I wouldn't be experiencing low back pain. So the other dimension here we have to think about is their experience of discomfort or pain, is that mapping onto tissue damage, or is it again something that they're maybe sensitive to and have not yet been have not changed that pattern enough? In other words, their body sends them signals like, if the body's sensitized to pain, if you have had tissue damage, if you do the same thing again, the signals of tissue damage, or the signals of pain rather, excuse me, will show up actually more quickly rather than less quickly. So the more, if you have injured yourself, your body and your nervous system is kind of on alert to that in possible injury again. So it'll signal pain to you sooner than it did before, and eventually it may even signal pain when there isn't any tissue damage at all. So that's a sensitized nervous system to pain. This shows up in chronic pain and a lot of other pathologies as well. So what I would do in order to assess this is I would try to get the student to a place, maybe laying on the ground in Shavasana, maybe just using the breath, and use a pain scale from 0 to 10. So let's say they're in a very comfortable position laying on their back. Maybe their knees are slightly elevated, the shoulders are open, they're in a comfortable environment. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. And then once you start instructing the breath, you maybe get them to regulate their breath and their nervous system. And then you could say, okay, now this as our baseline, between 0 and 10, where are you on a pain scale? And someone who hasn't had chronic pain yet, if they are comfortable, will probably report that they're feeling 0, right? And then you could start to add movements of the arms and legs, reaching the arms overhead, stretching the legs, and see if you can stay at a 0 out of 10 on the pain scale. And that's a good way to start. If you have someone with a nervous system that's already been very sensitized to pain because of prior injury or a lot of other traumas could contribute to that, they might still be experiencing, when you say everything's good, we're as comfortable as we can make you, but how are you feeling on a pain scale of 0 to 10? And they say, well, I'm at a 3. Then it's not the shape their body's in that's creating the pain. There's a residual pain signal there already. So at that point, then the yoga instructor's job would be not, of course, to try to work through, do more work regardless of the pain, but to try to find a way to bring that 3 down to a 2 or a 1 or eventually a 0. And of course, our scope of practice for this, just being movement practitioners, doesn't always lend itself to what we could do if our licensing was different. But what we try to do with auxiliary practices like breath work, like meditation, mindfulness, restorative yoga, try to get them so that pain scale will drop even more. I've talked quite a bit about that. I may have taken a little detour there, but that's kind of the way I approach it anyway.
That was awesome. Thank you. I'll take all the detours with you. I just love listening to you share all the wisdom that you're holding up in that beautiful head. So, in terms of pain and yoga asanas in particular, I have found that there are many common cues that are just widely accepted amongst yoga teachers. And I consider it almost like allopathic teaching, where we just fall into this rhythm of, oh, we've heard this cue, so let's just repeat it now. Even though when we talk about alignment, it doesn't totally make a lot of sense. And particularly for each practitioner, doesn't meet everybody where we're at, right? So I would like to hear your take on these common cues. And I've been going down this kind of rabbit hole lately of digging deep into the truth and the reality behind them. And so I'd love to hear your take on common cues and how that fits into the pain discomfort scale for students.
Great. Okay, yeah, this is a fun one. So absolutely, when you're learning anything new, if a teacher goes to a teacher training, a 200-hour training, there's a lot to know, there's a lot to learn in a short time. And also students have been visiting public yoga classes and they've been hearing cues from different teachers. So they actually have like a background kind of vocabulary in their head already that they may not even be aware of, things that are going to come out when they teach that they don't even know that they would say. So that's just habitual. We collect those kinds of things subconsciously, and a lot of those cues are helpful. And you could think of like a yoga cue, like almost like a meme, right? Something that works, it does its job, so it gets carried over. So if a yoga cue is too long, it won't survive. Let's say you said you wanted to teach a sun salutation. Let's take it from the beginning. You're standing in Tadasana, and a common cue is inhale, reach your arms overhead. Those of you who are listening, if you just say that to yourself, inhale, reach your arms overhead, that's about as much time as you have to say that, right? Because otherwise it would be too long. They'd be waiting for you to finish talking so that they could reach their arms overhead. So inhale, reach your arms overhead is a pretty good cue because it's just the right length and it gives them a direct thing to do. Anything longer than that, on your next inhale, lovingly sweep your arms overhead with a richness of being and extend your arm. That's not going to survive. So we know something too long won't work. And on the other hand, we know something that's too short and not descriptive enough won't work. I don't even know what that would be, like inhale, reach, something. It's just not quite enough information. So we know that the yoga cues that are going to survive transmission from person to person and from teacher to student are going to be the ones that you can say, and that they get the student to move the way that you'd like them to move. So in other words, your verbal cues are helping move the class from shape to shape. But then, having said that, you're going to have cues that are used as a shorthand that are descriptive and get the students to do something, but are not ideal for the function of what you actually want to achieve in the body. A classic one would be, after you folded forward, you've reached up in the sun salutation, you fold forward, bring your hands to the ground, inhale, look forward. So that's the cue, because again, it's short enough that inhale, and what we actually want to feel in the body and to see is a spinal elongation and extension. Hard, I know, if just for listening to this, but if you guys can imagine, your fingers are on the floor, you inhale, and rather than just compressing the back of your neck by jutting your chin forward, which is what look forward means, right? When your head is facing down and someone says look forward, you just move your neck, right? And that can often compress the back of the neck. What we actually want to achieve is a spinal elongation. So if you said fingers to the floor, inhale, elongate your spine, and using the length of your spine, carry that through so that your neck is congruent with the rest of the spine to bring the gaze forward, that's too long because it's only one breath, right? So then we think, okay, so that's not going to work. That won't get carried forward. And we know that inhale, look forward achieves some of what we want, but it isn't ideal because it isn't just the back of the neck compression we're looking for. It's a spinal elongation with a little bit of a back bend. It's actually the beginnings of a back bend. So I've been using cues like that make no sense linguistically, but work. Like inhale, stretch your gaze forward. Like that doesn't make any sense, but the word stretch applied with the gaze seems to achieve a certain result to get the spine to move in that direction. So that's one that I've looked at, and there's probably lots that you've heard too, Danya, before. Another one is flat back. Inhale, flat back, exhale, flat back, whatever, when moving from pose to pose. We know, of course, that the spine has natural curves, and we wouldn't really want to flatten those curves. So flat back can mean a neutral spine. And I would suggest in that case, inhale, neutral spine, or exhale, keep the spine neutral, could work because there's enough time to say it. And flat back is not particularly descriptive, and it is actually anatomically and functionally incorrect as well. So, but the thing is, once people start using this verbiage, it's really hard to stop doing it because it's a patter, right? That becomes so easy to say, and you've heard it, it's in one ear, and then it'll come out the mouth at another opportunity. So that requires the thing that you hope that your yoga teacher is doing, which is mindfulness, right? It requires, you're hoping that your yoga teacher is going home after they've taught you the class and going, I wonder which of these cues that I've been not particularly inquiring into, which of them could I toss and replace with better cues? And that, of course, I would encourage students, people learning how to teach yoga, to do that inquiry, right? To look at whether it works or not.
Thank you for that. We've been talking a lot about anatomy, and a lot of people in the Western world in particular are really focused on asana, and they consider that to just solely be the yoga practice, as the physical body, how we move it into different shapes. And we can see this revolution now coming, a revolution of reconnecting back to what people may consider the aim or original practice of yoga, bringing in mindfulness and awareness and meditation, really, when we talk about the path of Raja Yoga, right? And so I'm wondering, it seems like your path in particular has really drawn you to research the human body and the anatomy of how we move, functional physiology, right? So why do you think that that is so important to one's yogic path, even if our aim is something larger than just this physical manifestation?
Mm-hmm. That's another question that immediately brings into focus you could say the the two ideas of what it is to be alive, or what consciousness or awareness actually is. So just to keep it really simple, there's the one path that would say consciousness or awareness and the body are two different things, right? So that consciousness is somehow sort of trapped within the body, and then the practice of yoga would be to disentangle pure consciousness from its form. That's the path of Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras. His second sutra in that book, in that very short little manual on meditation, he says yoga is the cessation or the stilling of the fluctuations of individual consciousness. So what he means by that is that when we reach a state of meditative absorption, that's where we see ourselves the most clearly. In fact, what our identity is consciousness itself, and that form, meaning the body, meaning anything that's happening, any movements of the mind, that is all kind of an entrapment in a sense, and we need to reduce those movements, those waves, and the vicissitudes of life, such that we can then regain this sort of witness consciousness, you could say, and maybe even remain in that state for as long as possible, and maybe never to come back out again. So that would be called a dualistic, or meaning two parts philosophy. Consciousness and form are separate. Much later in the yoga tradition, a more popular for the householder, for the regular person, form of yoga would be tantra, which simply means to weave together aspects of knowledge of the feminine and the masculine, not to dishonor anything, but to essentially potentially include everything as part of consciousness. So when you see a tree grow, and you ask yourself, this tree seems to have an intelligence, its leaves are falling at a certain time of the year, its roots are growing deep so that it can sustain its branches. Is this tree not conscious? Is it not part of consciousness? Is form and consciousness separate? And the same with the body. The body has, I would say, has an innate intelligence, or not only an intelligence, a consciousness to it. Your body is telling you all kinds of things about your experience of the world, and whether to be comfortable or afraid. So I would say, and I follow this philosophy much more than the dualistic philosophy, which is that the body is actually a form of consciousness, in the same way that when you go out in the morning and it's maybe a humid morning, and you can feel the moisture in the air, and then you see a drop of dew form on a leaf. Well, that drop of dew that's formed on the leaf now is form, but it is of exactly the same substance as the moisture in the air. They're both H2O. And if you look at a block of ice, that block of ice is now in a very hard, stable form, but it again is nothing more than H2O, the same that's in the air, the same that's on the leaf, the same that is in the ice. And in the same way, in exactly the same way, human beings, in my mind, are a condensation of consciousness. We're not something that's separate from it. We are formed of nothing but consciousness. So in that case, then when you start to practice yoga and you say, well, yoga, and I've heard this before too, that postural yoga is just a preparation for something deeper, I would say that's missing the mark a little bit. I would say the exploration of the body in space, of discomfort and comfort, of dynamism, of change, of the way the body that can adapt, of the application of mindfulness to practice, that is all just as quote deep as any other practice you'd want to do. The idea of sitting and divorcing oneself from the body, that's fine too, but that's not to me any quote higher or more important than any other form of practice you want to take.
Thank you so much for that. I've personally been having a lot of conversations regarding this recently because um, in this path of work and offerings and whatnot, many people that I talk to have this idea that we need to transcend the body, and sure, maybe there is a part of that, but also my idea behind it is this is our gift, is this meat suit. So shouldn't we be also exploring what we were given and the magic of life and how we can actually interact with the world? So thank you so much for painting that picture.
Well, you're so welcome. Yeah, it's a really interesting. This is one I think where you really do get different intuitions from people based on their experience. And I just to support for a moment the other side of the coin, because I really leaned on the value of integration and the path of tantra there. But just to give props to the other side of the coin, of course, the body is a place of pain and discomfort and dissolution and death and all kinds of things that we really don't like to think about and probably don't want to experience. So it's as true as it is that the body is the place, our experience is the place where we are having moments of joy and feelings of transcendence. It is also a repository of a lot of pain and discomfort for people. So I think when you look at someone's history um, and the way they've experienced their lives, that may have something to do with the directions that they're being pulled towards in terms of the style of practice they choose. Very simply, if you're a really deep introvert, you're probably going to be more interested in spending longer periods of time by yourself doing things like meditation and practicing on your own. And if you really love to be around people, it might be a little more challenging to incorporate those practices because you're being pulled into the world to gain nourishment from other people. That's just the way you're built psychologically. So I do think that has a lot to do with the practices that we choose.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because as you look at the history of yoga, which is something that I really uh, acknowledge and appreciate your wisdom for, because you were the first person to really tell me about a lot of the rich depth of the history of yoga. Um, we can see that a lot of these ancient teachers or ancient gurus we're really changing the practice to meet each student, right? And I think that in our common society, we have this cut and paste, black and white kind of routine for everybody, that everybody will need the same thing, that we'll all follow the same path. But in yoga, yoga is creation, right? And there's so many different paths that all lead to the same spot. So being able to find the path that suits us while also honoring everybody else's path and respecting the path that they walk.
Yeah, absolutely. Something to remember too about the development of any tradition, and if you think about probably the best metaphor for this is music. We look at music and we think, okay, there's bluegrass, there's rock and roll, there's hip hop, and we categorize. We love to categorize things in our brains because we can understand them much better when we do that, and we make a differentiation between them by putting them in their own category. But the truth is musicians play all kinds of things, and the development of any one particular style of music doesn't happen in an instant. It has all kinds of influences from other forms of music, and it eventually gets distilled into something that we recognize as a category, and then we can call it something. And in the same way, whether the particular gurus within the yoga tradition or practitioners, they've learned from different people, and they have incorporated and enfolded those teachings into their own particular quote brand or way of explaining things. And then often retroactively, they'll have a label put on what they're doing. So the development of yoga and postural yoga in particular in the last 100 years, um, it isn't something that you can just put your finger on and say this is how it happened, because there's so much we don't know about its development on an individual level from teacher to teacher, the way that they took what they learned from their teachers and then found a way to explain it to their students. So it is a little bit like a game of telephone, right? Where you're learning something and passing it on, and it's going to get inflected and changed in that. And that has always been part of the tradition of yoga. That, in fact, is the tradition of yoga. So redevelopment, experimentation, absolutely honoring where the stuff came from, but also understanding that we're adding to that conversation as we teach.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that and for the inspiration to find our own path. Um, in regards to the history of yoga, I remember back to the teacher training that I did with you a decade ago now. One thing that really stood out from our yoga history class that I still share today is you presented the idea that perhaps yoga was developed amidst the agricultural revolution when there was a separation between humans and nature, and maybe offered as a path to find that reconnection. So I'd love to hear your take on that again, and especially for the listeners that have never heard or may have never heard this theory before.
Sure. Yeah. So we know pretty well, I mean, it's a well-established fact, I think, at this point, that around 10 to 14,000 years ago, there was a change in the way that human beings were living on the earth. Prior to that, we were, everyone knows this term, I think, hunter-gatherers. So we were moving probably seasonally in different areas, collecting food, um, eating a variety of things. But of course, we weren't planting anything in the ground at that point. So we would have been foraging and hunting, and we had a varied diet because of that. The integration of any one of those people with the natural world at that point would have been, I would say, extremely rich. Just, we know that just in order for anyone to survive. So if you took a hunter-gatherer, let's say the First Nations here in British Columbia, if you took any one of those people and put them anywhere in British Columbia, drop them off somewhere they didn't know where they were, they wouldn't think to themselves, oh my God, I'm lost in the forest. I need to get back to, my stove and my refrigerator. They would simply look around in the natural world and their environment and begin to live again, because that's what they were used to doing. So they knew how, they were kind of, in a sense, masters of surviving those environments. You have to know what plants are good for you, what plants are bad for you. You have to know how to track animals. You've got to be sensitive enough to live in that environment and have the ability to forecast what's going to happen next, use your intelligence and build tools and all that kind of thing in order to survive. So the beliefs that these people have had, and the ones that are still alive still have, they vary a little bit, but there are some common themes. There isn't a monotheistic God in general. They tend to see the world as what we would now refer to as animism. In other words, everything is alive. The trees, the rivers, the plants, the animals are alive. And there isn't a hierarchy of man down from there. And you can see this on totem poles and the First Nations have built, that yes, human beings are part of that whole structure of life, but they are not supreme. They don't reign supreme. So there's a sense that these peoples had, I believe, that they were an integrated part of life. They weren't separate from it. When we get into the agricultural revolution, we start planting food in the ground and cultivating land in order to grow more and more food. Of course, there's a population explosion that happens at the same time because we have more food, we have more calories. We begin to settle in larger groups. There's all kinds of other issues when that happens, but we are expanding the population greatly. But even after one generation of ceasing to be a hunter-gatherer and becoming agrarian, learning how to plant food in the ground, all of the skills and the integration necessary to be a successful hunter-gatherer are lost. even one generation later, if you took any of the people from the planting civilizations back again out into the wilderness and said, take care of yourself, they would be running for the nearest village because they don't know how to do it anymore. So not only is there a sense of unease with the natural world is now something that you need to protect yourself against because you don't know how to survive in it, but also you're continuously planting food in the ground and harvesting that food. And much later, of course, we get into things like chemical fertilizers, where we're now really coaxing the earth to give us more and more and more. The hunter-gatherer civilizations, when they killed an animal, would often have some sort of a simple ritual of thanks for that, for the life of that animal, in order to, again, harmonize what they'd done. They recognized they were taking a life that was necessary for them to survive, but they would give thanks and honor to that animal or to the spirit of that animal for its sacrifice. And now we're completely cut off from that. We don't have any, most people don't have any rituals of gratitude towards life at all in that way. So there's a richness of being that the hunter-gatherers probably had that the agrarian societies no longer had. But I think psychologically human beings have a need for integration, for gratitude, for the sense of love and belonging. But because we cut ourselves off psychologically and functionally from the rest of nature, we thought, okay, this is my opinion of what happened. Is we said, well, then beauty and truth and purity and consciousness, you could say, or God, can no longer exist in the things that we're constantly, taking. We're taking the food and asking for more. We're not treating the planet in a way, we're not treating it with love. So it must not be valuable. It must not be worthy. It must be dirty. It must be something we should remove ourselves from. The goodness, the purity, consciousness itself must live somewhere else. Maybe it lives in the mountains, like in Mount Olympus, where the gods live, or even higher than that into the celestial spheres. So we began to project the sense of purity and wholeness, and you could say soul or God, into the heavens and away from the earth. And this is where you see this dualistic split, where form and the earth are no longer seen as valuable, and all of the good things are going to happen later on. So that's where I see yoga stepping in and saying, wait a minute. Now, yoga doesn't explicitly try to remedy this divide. It often actually tends to fortify it even more, like I mentioned, dualistic yoga. But I think what it can do when we look at it is to say, okay, is there a way to start noticing and reigniting a gratitude for our own bodies, for our environment, for the animals that we're eating, and to try to reestablish a connection and find beauty in the things that are around us, rather than projecting that they exist somewhere else.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much for painting that picture and for describing and going deeper into the definition of dualism as well. Um, I have one more question for you before we end our chat here. We I get asked this question a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, and I'd love to hear your take on it. What does yoga mean to you?
That's a question that I always ask my students almost on day one. I probably did that with you as well. And it's a great question because it's a hard one to answer. I think the easiest one way for me to say it would be that yoga to me is a method. Yoga is a way of applying my capacities for reasoning, for feeling. It gives me in a sense, a boundary, a methodology for moving forward in the way that I would like. So yoga could be the postures, it could be meditation, it could be just simply being aware of what's going on at any one moment. But yeah, it's a way of moving forward in the world. It's an application of means so that I can, I guess, hopefully live the best life that I can, which to me also just means trying to understand as much as I can.
Thank you for that. And so maybe the path of yoga gives you this understanding of yourself.
Yeah, I think so. I think the whole, our we don't even really know exactly what we are. I mean, that's something that's been up for discussion for probably ever since human beings have been around. Where are we going? Where did we come from? What are we? We're invisible in some sense to ourselves. So yeah, the methodology of yoga gives you some of the tools to begin to at least ask interesting questions.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for taking time out of your day to ask my interesting questions.
It's my pleasure, Tanya. And great to
It
see you
was
again.
such, yes, you too. Thank you so much.
So much gratitude to Daniel for being here on the podcast with me. I have nothing but love in my heart for him and what he does. If you would like to stay connected with Daniel, you can find him on Facebook through Daniel Clement. That's DanielClement. You can also find him through his website, www.danielclementyoga.com. He is now based in Vancouver and currently offers many yoga trainings out of his space there. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. This has been such an honor being here. My name is Danya. I am the lead facilitator and founder of Wild Song Yoga, and it is such a blessing and an honor to be here sharing this wisdom from all of these potent teachers with you all. So thank you so much. From my heart to yours, namaste. My name is Danya Buak. I am the lead facilitator and founder of Wild Song Yoga School. Thank you all so much for tuning in and for stepping into this space of learning and growing with these potent wisdom keepers. It is a deep honor and a deep blessing to be here curating and magically weaving all of this knowledge for you. So thank you so much. From my heart to each and every one of yours, namaste.